AME Grand Rounds. I'd like to welcome you today. We're going to be learning about feedback, getting beyond good job, which I think we all could always use a lot of work on. So really happy to have our presenters here today. You'll see up on the slide today. We have, thank you so much for being here, our esteemed group of anesthesiologists. We have Brenda Buckland leading the charge here. Many of us know Dr. Buckland from her many years of medical education here at the CU School of Medicine, where she's been, she served as assistant dean for the clinical core curriculum from 2010 to 2017, and she currently is a professor in our School of Medicine and VP for Education in the Department of Anesthesiology and in our School of Medicine's. She is also in our School of Medicine's Associate Dean for Continuing Medical Education. What we don't know about her, that I didn't know, she's been a national leader in anesthesiology education with many major roles for the American Board of Anesthesiology. So we're so happy to have her leading the charge here today. She's joined by some of her proteges from Children's and from the VA. We have Dr. Brown, and he works at our Nathaniel Brown at our VA, where he teaches residents and medical students, and he's also the director of academic remediation for the Department of Anesthesiology. So a big role there for Dr. Brown. Also Dr. Clopton. Dr. Clopton comes to us from Children's, where she is a pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist. She's the course director for cardiovascular physiology in our anesthesiologist assistant program, and is also active in medical student and resident fellow education. So lots of different levels of education there. And then our newest member, Dr. Deer, Jeremy Deer, please welcome him. He's joined us recently from Northwestern University and Lurie's Children's Hospital to serve as the Director of Education in Pediatric Anesthesia and then the Fellowship Program Director as well. So we're so happy that he's joined our School of Medicine. So thank you very much for joining us today. I would just like to say that we would love it if you put your questions in the chat, and we'll be curating those and delivering those sort of in between and at the end. We'll also have a Q&A session, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Thank you very much. Dr. Bucklin.
Thank you so much, Linda. We are so pleased to be here today to bring this Grand Rounds to you. We've provided it for the Department of Anesthesiology, and so we really appreciate this invitation to be here. And I know that on behalf of my three colleagues, we are incredibly pleased. So with that, let's think about feedback. And we know that we are all teachers and learners in some capacity, right? But when it comes to feedback, it's often vague. It's not very actionable. We're always worried about negativity and hurting someone's feelings, right? So today we are going to take a look at feedback and how we can actually have a best practice approach to feedback. So I want to start by sharing this first quote with you, because that's really why we need feedback, is because we need to improve and we want to improve. And so that is true for our learners as well as teachers alike. So today, what are we going to be talking about? Well, first of all, after this introduction, we're going to be discussing learning goals, and Dr. Brown is going to be talking about those and learning goals in their role of feedback. Then Dr. Clopton will be talking about a growth mindset, which is very important in that feedback cycle. And then finally, Dr. Deer is going to be talking about improving our feedback and a best practice approach to providing feedback. So these are the learning objectives today. We're going to be defining feedback, talking about the importance of feedback. How can we integrate learning goals into the feedback cycle? fostering a growth mindset, and then finally applying the principles of the feedback in effective teaching. So what is feedback and what it isn't? Well, first of all, one of our goals for feedback is to promote reflection and growth. It's about our own learning as well as performance, and it's identification of gaps and as well as in knowledge as well as skills. And that's how we can enhance our growth and encourage a better performance. So what isn't feedback? Well, it's often praise, but it's not really feedback. And so good job, read more, keep up the good work are all examples of praise, but not feedback. So why is it important? Well, what we find is that trainees want our feedback, and studies suggest actually that there is never enough. Also, what's important for us as teachers is giving high quality feedback, and that is actually positively correlated with teacher ratings. So if we give constructive, specific feedback, both knowledge as well as skills are improved. So I talked to Linda a little bit earlier today, and she wondered how we came upon this topic and this group of people to present. And so looking at this particular article, which is a 12 tips article to improve a feedback culture, I thought it was important for us to take a look at this because, you know, evidence-based medicine was popularized in the 1990s. But as time has gone on, we have found that education is also dependent upon evidence, and evidence-based teaching has become more popular. So this is really about setting the culture for feedback and developing the relationship between the learner, the teacher. There's also an institutional context that we need to be thinking about, and culture, and then that feedback relationship. And so this really sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Nathaniel Brown to share his so that we can learn more about learning goals. Thank you, Nathaniel.
All right, well, thank you guys. So we're going to be talking about how to create learning goals here. So with that in mind, let's jump in and ask what is a goal? It's good to start with the basics. So goals come in overlapping flavors. Just sort of to state the obvious, they're set by different people, and those different people are going to have different agendas and therefore ends in mind for their goals. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. And a goal can look quite different depending on where you stand. If goals are not made explicit, they can be in conflict with each other. I mean, heck, they can be in conflict even when they are made explicit, but the conflict danger is much greater with implicit goals. And that's one of the reasons it's important to formulate and spend some time thinking about how to formulate a goal. So let's talk about a couple of families of goals. So getting through the day or getting through a rotation without overt criticism from those who are teaching you is a common goal for learners. Improving knowledge is a common goal for learners as well. You'll notice that the improving knowledge goal is very vague, whereas the getting through the day goal is very specific. That's going to be important later. Attaining mastery, we'll touch on this a few times, is a difficult goal. And we often assume that it happens kind of automatically. You go through the program, that's what the program steps are for, and you will be a master at the end of it. But that's not necessarily true. Broadly speaking, in the psychology literature, there are two, or at least in the performance psychology literature, there are two types of goals in adult education. There are performance goals and learning goals. And this will harken back to what was on the previous slide. A performance goal is seeking a favorable judgment from someone whose job it is to either criticize you or in some way evaluate you. A learning goal is seeking to increase competence in a certain area. It is more intrinsic than extrinsic. It comes from the learner typically. It's often assumed, obviously, by the educator as well. Both of these types of goals, families of goals, performance and learning, can lead to mastery. This is actually a little controversial in the adult education psychology literature, but there's a fair amount of evidence that both can, with a really, really important caveat. Learners that are low in confidence were shown to have performance goals substantially hamper the amount they eventually learned. Their route to mastery was hurt by setting performance goals as opposed to learning goals. So tailoring goals is very important, even on the level of sort of the family of goal before you get down to specifics. So let's talk about who is going to be setting these goals and how. Should everyone be at the table? No, definitely not. There are 3 groups that need to be involved: the masters of the art, the apprentices of the art, and those who make the environment of learning. These 3 map pretty nicely onto teachers, learners, and systems. And really, these are the only folks that should be involved in goal setting. You'll notice that the second quote unquote group is the only group of 1 person. The others are groups of multiple people. So what do goals do? In graduate medical education, learning goals iteratively lead to achieving mastery. So mastery doesn't mean being good at something. It means getting so good at something that you reach this sort of asymptotic line of incredibly diminishing returns, where great effort is required for relatively smaller and smaller gains. So an overview of a topic for a master would yield no substantial benefit and knowledge. This is actually a really good thing, but it's a super hard adjustment for a lot of learners to make, because at the collegiate level and at the undergraduate medical education level, we are used to receiving new topics and quickly achieving some degree of success short of mastery. And so we're used to being on this like really rewarding part of the learning curve where, proportionate effort and growth in knowledge go hand in hand, and achieving that mastery section is a difficult transition. So for the learner, the mastery mindset is a difficult pivot, as I mentioned. Goals need to be able to be built on themselves so that they can progress as knowledge increases. And even learning how to set goals like that can be difficult. So the learner needs input from teachers and systems. For the teacher, they are confronted with a new, especially teachers like myself who are fairly early on in the process. We now need to pivot ourselves to being able to provide better feedback, to be able to help a learner recognize his or her strengths and goals, or strengths and weaknesses rather. And we need to learn, basically what I'm saying is we need to learn the skill of teaching, which is not automatic. So there are different, let's talk about different kinds of goals from the perspective of the teacher and the systems, the multi-people goal setting sections, as I mentioned earlier. Goals are often set by rotation in terms of what the objectives for a rotation are. Those are goals, generally speaking. And they're going to be different for different subspecialty rotations. And of course, there are going to be goals that are implicit and never really stated, such as becoming a good physician, right? These types of rotation-driven goals are typically a blend of teacher and systems. They interplay. They're general, though. They're always general because they have to apply to all of the learners that are going to come through that system. And they're going to have, of course, a diversity of different learning styles and personalized goals. Learner-driven goals are kind of where the rubber hits the road. They need to be tailored to the specific learner, obviously. And who's best to help, especially novice goal setters, to do that? And that's the immediate teacher. The systems level can encourage, and the teacher can, sort of next level down in the onion, the teacher can help, but ultimately the learner does need to be establishing their own goals, and so the onus needs to be on them. And Dr. Clopton is going to discuss why and how a growth mindset will lead to better intrinsic motivation. There are different kinds of goals that are going to vary based on the time scale that we're talking about here. I encourage people to set goals when they're working with me, goals for that specific day. Maybe if we're going to work together a few times in a week, goal for the week. And obviously, they'll have greater goals going out further in time. The farther out in time they go, the more vague the goals get, and that's okay. It's all right to have vague goals as long as they're becoming more and more specific, building on each other layer by layer as the learner progresses through time. Let's talk a little bit about this concept called the Johari window. It's many decades old now. It comes from the psychology literature, and it's a really neat idea. Basically, this is a little graph of how, in this context, how learners and teachers and systems are going to interact. So self in this diagram is the learner. The idea, the goal of having a robust feedback culture, which is what all four of us are talking about today, is to expand that upper left-hand corner of the diagram there, what you know and what others know that you know. So as that area gets bigger, necessarily speaking, that lower right-hand window, the sort of unknown, the big unknowns, shrinks through iteration, through continuing to learn yourself and to grow in knowledge of your field and of how you learn, and others also iterating that with you, your teachers specifically. So there are different ways to set goals, and I'm not going to talk a great deal about this. I just want to mention a couple of things that are pretty robustly agreed upon in the psychology literature, and that is goals need to be deliberate, and they need to be constantly revised. So basically they need to be iterated. The iSMART acronym is one, and I'll just pop that up here, and it's a great one because it kind of hits lots of the points. But as long as you are iterating your goals and making them specific, and able to have feedback based on them, not just becoming a better doctor, any set of them, of ways of working with them will work. One analogy that I like to use for it is a PDSA cycle. That this is kind of how it should. This is how trial and error should go. Not just a single like, oh, I did it work? But think about how you set it, deliberately put it in motion, analyze it afterward, and then back to the beginning. See how it went. What should you change? That's a good trial and error way to approach creating learning goals. And that is what I have.
Hello, so, okay. I'll go ahead and start now. I'm Rachel Clopton. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I have titled my presentation Growth Mindset, Harnessing the Power of Yet to Overcome the Tyranny of Now. I have to start with the disclaimer that nothing I'm about to say is my own work. I'm going to be describing the work of two psychologists, Carol Dweck, who's at Stanford, and Angela Duckworth, who's at Penn, who have really revolutionized how we teach and how we measure excellence. However, I will say these concepts changed the trajectory of my life before I knew they existed. And I think Dr. Bucklin asked me to speak about this after we had an interview and I talked about some of my personal experiences. I think the most important one for me was when I was a junior in high school, I went from my local high school in rural Oklahoma to the Oklahoma School of Science and Mathematics, which is an extremely competitive publicly funded boarding school for high school juniors and seniors with aptitudes in math and science. I've always been good at standardized tests and was placed into a math class above where I should have actually been. That, along with college level chemistry, physics, literature, and history, made this semester literally the most challenging academic experience of my life to date. This was the first time I'd ever been remotely challenged, and I especially struggled with math and the corresponding physics class. I became scared of math and I began to dread it. And this was sad because this was a common situation for a girl from a small town. And I distinctly remember one evening after Thanksgiving, I had an awakening. I realized that if I wanted to graduate from OSSM, there would be a lot more math in my future. And if I didn't understand this pre-calculus, then calculus would be hard. And if calculus was hard, every advanced math and science class would be harder. And I was not going to be just another girl who wasn't good at math. And my studying changed completely. Instead of shying away from concepts that I didn't understand right away, I dug into them. I redid my homework, went to office hours every week, and I spent hours studying even when my very driven and studious classmates were having fun. I got A's in those classes, but more important, that feeling of helpless desperation was gone. I didn't always study with the same intensity or brute force, but I carried that same mentality of leaning into hard things with me. And when I got to college, I chose chemical engineering as a major, and I was a good engineer because I was good at math. And more importantly, I wasn't scared of doing hard things. So this next slide is two pictures of West Point cadets. The big one in the background is from the 2020 graduation parade. Graduating from West Point is obviously a major accomplishment, but being accepted into West Point may be just as big. The application process is about 2 years long, and it consists of determining each applicant's whole candidate score, which is a compilation of academic performance, physical fitness, leadership, and an interview with the candidate's United States Senator or representative. Successful matriculation at West Point is predicted very well by this whole candidate score, along with a battery of psychological and intellectual testing entering plebes, which is the name for first years, undergo the day after they arrive at the academy. However, up to 10% of this incoming class never makes it to the beginning of plebe year. Prior to the start of official classes, incoming cadets must complete Beast Barracks, which is basically cadet boot camp. It's designed to break cadets down mentally, emotionally, and physically, and test them in ways that they've never been tested before. The whole candidate score is really terrible at predicting survival of Beast, or making it to the smaller picture in the foreground. And this is the 12-mile march back to campus from Camp Butner, where Beast Barracks is held. So enter the grit scale. In the early 2000s, the grit scale was added to the battery of tests incoming cadets underwent prior to starting Beast. It has proven to be the only measure that actually predicts survival at Beast. So what is grit? Grit is a concept that Dr. Duckworth developed when she was interested in studying what makes great people great. She studied Olympic athletes, Nobel Prize winners, prima ballerinas, and Fortune 500 CEOs. And this is what she found. Yes, combat and aptitude were at play, but the common link between the extremely high performers wasn't talent, but it was these qualities. The tendency to not abandon tasks for more changeability, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, the tendency not to abandon tasks in the face of obstacles, and living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. Where these extremely high performers were different was their tenacity, their passion, and their perseverance. So she developed the grit scale to measure these qualities. New ideas and projects, and these are the questions she asked. New ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones. Setbacks don't discourage me. I don't give up easily. I often set a goal, but later choose to pursue a different one. I am a hard worker. I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete. I finish what I begin. My interests change from year to year. I am diligent. I never give up. I have been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, but later lost interest. I have overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge. And this is what determined which West Point cadets, who just a month prior to arriving had been the class valedictorians, the captains and stars of their sports teams, the class presidents, would survive Beast Barracks, when basically half of them were below average for the first time. And even if they were above average, they were in the throes of the most stressful experience of their young lives. Duckworth's work has shown that talent is not what makes you gritty. Grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to traditional markers of talent. When asked, Duckworth admittedly had little insight into how to teach grit, but she did point to Dweck's work regarding the growth mindset. So what is a growth mindset? A growth mindset versus fixed mindset is a concept developed by Dr. Dweck, a professor in psychology at Stanford, to describe two different ways people approach learning. But in reality, it can be applied to basically everything. And in fact, a lot of her current research has to do with applying growth mindset to conflict resolution. So a fixed mindset. A capacity for performance and intelligence is based on innate talent and ability. People who have a fixed mindset have an intense fear of failure and a very strong desire to appear smart. This person tends to avoid challenges because they are afraid of failure, unmasking deficiencies. They see being challenged as bad or scary. They also tend to give up easily and see effort in a negative light, both because it's something less talented people have to put forth in a large quantity and because it's fruitless because talent is really fixed. These people tend to have a difficult time receiving feedback because they take it as a personal assault. They also feel threatened by success of others. So you can imagine there's a propensity for plateauing early and not reaching full potential or even quitting. Growth mindset, on the other hand, is the capacity for performance intelligence can be developed. People with a growth mindset see failure as an opportunity to learn. They enjoy doing challenging things because they understand that their performance today does not define their capacity for performance tomorrow, next week, or even next year. Also, they're less worried about appearing smart because why waste time looking smart when you can actually be getting smarter? They see effort as a necessary path to success, regardless of how much talent they have. They seek out feedback and use it as an opportunity to learn. They also find inspiration from other successful people. They don't want to be the most talented person in the room. And of course, this can be a continuum, and people can even have different mindsets for different aspects of their lives. Organizations can also be growth mindset or fixed mindset. Dr. Dweck interviewed employees at multiple Fortune 500 companies, and employees at each company identified their organization in the same category pretty much across the board. Fixed mindset companies focused on identifying, recruiting, and basically buying the best talent. However, within a few years, most managers of these talented, sought-after employees described them as frequently not realizing their potential or having already moved on to another company. There was little company loyalty among employees, and when things went wrong, there was a lot of blame involved. Sometimes people really did pay the price. Because of this, cheating or just general bad behavior was seen as more acceptable. Employees who identified their company as having a growth mindset, on the other hand, talked about the importance placed on teamwork. They felt empowered to learn, innovate, and create. The managers at these companies also spoke of their young employees as having great potential for growth. Employees had much more company loyalty, and practices like cheating were much less accepted. So, cultivating a growth mindset, changing the meaning of difficulty. Babies have an extreme growth mindset. They're constantly trying new things and failing, and this is exactly how they learn. But then, as they grow up, they slowly lose it and become more aware of the world around them and their perceived place in it. I imagine most people listening to this, myself included, spend a good portion of our youth, at least, in a fixed mindset. And that's because many of us were identified early on as the S word, and the S word is smart. So stop and think about what happens when a child is called smart. They're put on a pedestal, and for most people, being put on a pedestal is desirable. And then a significant amount of their energy is spent maintaining or defending that position. and doing things that bring them the feeling of deserving that recognition. This leads to a lot of anxiety of the unknown and of challenges, and anxiety about being found out for not actually being smart. And this concept also applies to other sides of the coin, to young people who are told that they are stupid or that they are bad kids. So that's the bad side, but we can teach growth mindset as well, and the outcomes are actually pretty impressive. One of the great examples of this is from 2014 paper, and it describes a game called Brain Points for elementary school children. So this is a math game where students got points for sustaining efforts, trying multiple strategies, and making progress instead of just zooming through and getting the right answers. That's what the control game was. In the control game, high achievers liked it and played the longest. In the Brain Points version, though, more students overall and many, many more of the lower achieving students immersed themselves in the game, and they made the most progress when skills acquisition was measured at the end of the study. Another study looked at 7th graders who were struggling in math. They were split into 2 groups to receive extra attention. Half of them were taught good study skills and had extra tutoring. The other half were taught growth mindset. They were taught that their brains can grow like muscles if they exercise them, and their brains can form new connections and they can actually get smarter. Challenges were presented as opportunities to exercise their brains to grow rather than opportunities to embarrass themselves if they don't understand. At the end of the year, progress in the 2 groups was measured, and the first group, unfortunately, had continued decline in math, while the second group, who was taught the concept of growth mindset, showed a sharp rebound in skills and grades. This concept can also be applied to large groups or communities to create a growth mindset environment. Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who is a former graduate student under Dr. Dweck and a current professor at University of Washington, studied the idea of changing the perspectives of a community by going into the Native American community in Washington State where she grew up. This community was very close to Seattle and in the same school district as schools where students whose parents were wealthy Microsoft employees attend. Her community school frequently performed at the bottom of the district. She started the project by working with teachers during the summers to teach them how to teach growth mindset to their students. She also worked with parents and even created an instructional TV show about growth mindset and how to incorporate it into home life. Once school started, the kids were told every day that their teachers were going to help them grow their brains. She hosted frequent events in the evening focused on building growth mindset in the community. Everyone was committed. And after only 1 year, kindergarten and first grade students' scores were at the top of the district, and older kids in grades 3 through 5 were gaining up to 2 years worth of skills per year. So all this is great, but it doesn't really directly apply to medical training. How do we cultivate a growth mindset? And this is where feedback comes in. And Dr. Deere will continue to talk about feedback at the end after my presentation. So praising for ability promotes fixed mindset, i.e. in my world of pediatric cardiac anesthesia, great job for putting in that A line so fast, you're a natural. Praising for effort promotes growth mindset, i.e. a week on the cardiac rotation. I'm really impressed with how hard you worked this week and how much progress you made managing sick neonates. These babies are challenging, but these cases can be so rewarding. Of course, frequently we have to focus on the results in the moment. This is when it's important to circle back at the end of the case. So on a cardiac rotation, for example, fellows are frequently very frustrated about missing lines or difficult cases, and I spend a lot of time talking about my own struggles and being open about the challenging nature of what we do. For example, did you know after a difficult Glenn procedure, which is the second stage in palliation and hypoplastic left heart syndrome, I would say to them something like, did you notice that Dr. Twite magically appeared when we came off bypass and the mean arterial pressure was 40 and the SATs were 50? Dr. Twite is my boss and he's one of my mentors. That's because I called him to see if there's anything else I could do, anything I was missing or anything I could change. Because at the end of the day, we all struggle, we all ask for help, and that's part of the job. And if we're not winning, then we're learning. So Another aspect of this is the journey to expertise, which is something in medicine and in life we're all trying to achieve. So growth mindset isn't just important for students or trainees. Angela Duckworth talks about the 10-year rule. There is really no domain of expertise where world-class performers have put in fewer than 10 years of deliberate practice to achieve their skills. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, gives the metric of 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve world-class expertise. And this corresponds to 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year for 10 years. So many of you are probably thinking, well, that's a big underestimate of how much I work. But the key to that metric is the term deliberate practice. And this is not just doing something over and over again, like running the same 5-mile loop at the same moderate speed every day. Dr. Duckworth describes 4 steps in deliberate practice. The first is to identify the skill that you're trying to master and work systematically to acquire the skill that you currently lack. You have to set a stretch goal. The next step is purposefully and systematically working on that goal with complete concentration. This involves checking your ego at the door because you're not going to be doing things that you're good at or things that are easy. You're purposefully going to devote time to doing something that you're bad at. And this can be really uncomfortable and really exhausting. But experts have learned how to become comfortable with this discomfort, to revel in it because they know that they're growing and developing their skills. The next step is to receive feedback, which can be equally challenging because the feedback is often quite critical and easily perceived as negative. As educators, we should focus on making feedback as immediate and as specific as possible, which leads to the final step, incorporating the feedback and refining and adjusting techniques. Then you get up and do it again the next day. And that's how you become an expert or an outlier. The difference between someone who is average or even good at something compared to someone who is an expert is that experts are able to stay on the steep part of that graph in the previous slide longer. And deliberate practice is not something that stops when your training ends. I mean, if you consider my situation, I'm 3 years into my career as an attending pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist. And according to one of my senior partners, who is very much a close mentor of mine, Dr. Ng, it takes 4 years before a congenital cardiac surgeon will trust that a new anesthesiologist is not actively trying to kill their patients. And then, according to Dr. Duckworth, I have another 7 years before I may be a real expert. But if you think about the 10,000 hour rule, it's likely even more than that. So this final slide, sorry. So for me and everybody, growth mindset, it's a journey. And we all have to constantly check ourselves to notice when we might bristle when things get hard or start to shy away from challenges, or when you begin to feel prideful or jealous, and to accept that living a life characterized by continuing learning and growth mindset is a journey, and it's frequently not an easy one. And then I close with this quote from Will Smith that I think personifies this whole talk. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is that I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. You might have more talent than me, you might be smarter than me, but if we get on a treadmill together, there are 2 things. 1, you're getting off first, or 2, I'm going to die. It's really that simple. Thank you.
Rachel, I hope it's okay if I take over for you.
Yes.
Let's see here. Uh-oh. Where did my files go? We practiced this and everything. Huh. Let me try this. Can everyone see this? Okay. I hope. Okay.
We're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh no. Interesting. Still nothing?
No.
Let me exit out of this. Oh my goodness, I have so many important things to say.
Jeremy, do you want to send them to me and then I can post them and you can say next slide?
Yeah, that seems,
There you go. Yeah, now we can see it, Jeremy, or we can see your screen.
okay. How about now? Everyone see it?
No,
Okay.
we see your screen, but we can't see the presentation.
We're seeing your desktop. Do you have two screens in front of you? No.
Let me try this again.
Jeremy, maybe go to stop share and then hit start share again
How
with
about
your
now?
presentation.
There we go.
open.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think it was a two-screen situation. I'm not sure why. I need to go to like a Zoom graduate course or something. So I'm gonna put my glasses on so I can look smart, since I clearly am already failing. It's my growth mindset. Thank you, Rachel. So I apologize for the snafu. So my disclaimer is this. I'm not sure how I became potentially, quote, an expert in feedback, other than the fact that I've just dedicated my career to giving it, whether trainees want it or not, unfortunately. And so I think it has made me a little bit more robust in giving it. So in this picture, what you see, this is me giving this 30-day-old little infant in Nepal some feedback, if you will. Please forgive me for my robust taste in PPE. I was trying, but I was in a relatively developing country. So I'm going to talk about feedback. And I think what's interesting about feedback is, as I've kind of already alluded to, I've never really shied away from it. As you can see in this picture, sometimes I feel like that I have traits of my grandmother, who was one of my mentors, probably a little bit too harshly. And what you see in the bottom corner of the slide now that I've figured out how to share my screen is that feedback was originally defined back in a kind of a landmark paper around the early 1980s in the journal in JAMA, about that feedback really is an objective appraisal of, it says past performance. I actually like to take out the word past, but it's an objective appraisal of performance. And the goal is actually kind of improving future performance. And so one of the things that I try to do is that, it's partly my personality, but when I work with trainees, I'm very corrective in the moment. And oftentimes I find myself actually having to tell them, stop, this is actually feedback. I'm giving you feedback now, which is a little tasteless, I understand, but I want them to know where I'm coming from and that I'm trying to actually make their performance better. Let's see, moving on. So one of the things I want to kind of focus on initially, and several of the previous presenters have actually kind of set me up for success here, but feedback is not an evaluation. And I think that's just really important because I look at them two separately. And even as you look at the literature about feedback and evaluation and current medical educational practices, you'll actually see these words used interchangeably. And it really kind of bothers me because they're not interchangeable concepts. And in fact, if you look at this graphic, which is actually a reiteration from a recent publication that I actually kind of pirated from, but it actually defined what was defined as formative feedback and summative feedback. And I took it a step further. I said, well, summative feedback is actually just evaluation. And as we focus on today, based on the previous presenters and what I'm going to kind of present to you today, is that we really should be focusing on giving formative feedback. We know that trainees actually long for formative feedback. In fact, there are several studies from the AAMC, published in JAMA, looking at several different previous articles, is that the one thing that trainees actually crave is feedback, and they feel across the board that they don't get enough of it. And so really, you should be kind of tailoring your practice, your educational practice, such that you, during a specific encounter, you should be giving direct feedback. It should demonstrate ongoing improvement. And basically, it's this idea of tell me how I'm doing so that I can do better next time. Now, one of the things that Rachel said, which I think is really important, and I totally love the picture of the baby doing push-up, which looks like, admittedly, that baby's actually doing better at push-ups than I am, but that that children are actually very moldable in their behaviors and their patterns and setting standards. And by the time we get to adults and adult learners for certain, we actually have already kind of missed the boat. And we'll talk about here in just a few minutes how we can actually kind of change that paradigm. But on the right side of the screen, you see the idea, the concept of summative feedback. And I actually say that that's actually not the case. It's evaluations. And if you've been doing your job as an educator and you've been giving formative feedback all along, then when it comes time to an evaluation, really your learner or your trainee really shouldn't be surprised by what there is going to be or what is going to be said on their evaluation. So this is a great little pictorial, if you will, from a 2019 British Medical Journal article that basically, I think, gives the essence of what feedback should be. And I do believe it was Dr. Bucklin who kind of touched on this as well, is that this really should be a cyclical process, right? And I like to use the analogy of, if you're a lone person on a raft and you're in the middle of a body of water, let's say an ocean, God forbid, and you're actually trying to paddle to safety, trying to paddle to some sort of reassurances, that without the presence of feedback, then you're just paddling towards nothing, and you're likely to set yourself up for failure, and you're likely to set yourself up for disappointment. And so we all need feedback so that we can actually paddle to a more sound shore, if you will. Sorry for the really cheesy analogy, but it actually is a good one if you think about it. So in this cyclical nature, we have feedback. It should really impart reflection, which should actually help us do demonstrable action. And that action should actually help improve our performance and make us better providers. So there actually are several different models for feedback. And what I've done is I've taken probably, I think, the two most effective, and again, this is my personal opinion, but as someone who's kind of, riddled the research or the literature for looking at different models of feedback and how we can be better, there really are two models that kind of come out that are actually probably the most predominant. And what I would actually encourage you, or what I would actually what I'd like to pontificate, is that really when you look at all these different models, they're really kind of the same concept. And these two right here have slightly different adaptations, but I'm presenting both of them to you just so you know where some of our classic, more current models of feedback presentation are coming from. And so on the right, the left side of the screen is the R2-C2 model. This is actually a model that was actually devised based on some pretty intense psychological aspects of human interaction. So this actually comes from our psychological or psychiatric literature. And basically the idea is that it's R2-C2. So there are two R components and there are two C components. And the idea is that you build outward in. And so you want to build rapport with your trainees. You want to explore reactions, right? You want to see how they feel about certain particular learning experiences. And then once you've kind of explored those, then you move on to the C portion, which is exploring the content of your interactions. And then you want to coach for change. The model on the right is the ADAPT, or what's called the Prepare to Adapt model, which was actually devised by a group of internists out of the University of Washington. And it's a very similar model, but the idea is that you build an educational alliance. And it's really, that feedback conversations should be just that. And it should be a negotiation between being a supportive educational relationship between the learner as the central role, and then actually helping break down anxiety, clarifying expectations, improving efficiency with providing feedback, and then basically kind of setting reflection and goals that are in concert together of things that you as the educator want to improve in the learner. Let's see. So I always love the idea of concept. So I'm a Hoosier at heart. And for those of you that have never set foot in the Midwest, you have no idea what a Hoosier is, but a Hoosier is someone from Indiana. It's one of those small I states in the middle of the country. And I grew up loving this man, although as you can look by the picture, he's not terribly lovable in this picture. But when I think of coaching, this is always the first concept that comes from, or that I think of. And this is actually Bobby Knight from a very colorful game that we played against Purdue. I want to say it was in the 80s, although I honestly can't remember the date at the moment. Although this made him famous, got him suspended, I think one other additional time from Indiana University, he was one of the most beloved coaches. And actually they've interviewed several of his players throughout the years. And despite the fact that he had these kind of national outbursts that draw a lot of attention, he's actually decorated as one of the most beloved coaches of collegiate basketball of all time. But I do not recommend this manner of coaching when you're working with your trainees. Please forgive me in actually kind of highlighting some of the anesthesia literature, but I think what's interesting here is that the concepts are relatively the same. And what I've shown you here is two articles. One on the left is actually an original article, probably one of the most original articles in anesthesia literature as it relates to medical education. And what's interesting about this article was it was really one of the first retrospective looks, maybe prospective looks actually, at anesthesia training programs. And what Dr. Rosenblatt really did was she kind of surveyed all the anesthesia residency programs at a time where anesthesia was not a very popular residency. In fact, they were really scrounging to actually get people to join anesthesia at that time. And what she found, she actually had a pretty impressive response rate. About 86% of programs responded to her. And ultimately what this found was that there was a tremendous amount of variation in techniques and methodologies regarding evaluation, feedback, and remediation. And more impressively was that only roughly about 20% of programs at this time actually put any stock into actually challenging and educating their faculty. And so a more recent article, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about this article on the right by Dr. Schlecht is she's actually a private practice anesthesiologist, but she wrote a fantastic review article on how to actually incorporate feedback, not only to anesthesia training programs, but actually I think it's very applicable to all training programs. And what she kind of highlights and what I've kind of dissected out of there is that if you don't have feedback, your learners are adrift, just like that sailor on that ship. They're gonna paddle towards something and they don't know what they're paddling to. And when they don't know what they're paddling to, they're more susceptible to interpreting your body language, right? So if you look at them, if you smile, they may think they did a good job. If you say nothing at all, if you frown, then they think they did a bad job. They develop false standards. And anesthesia, immediately when you join anesthesia, one of the biggest risks or concerns is that, am I gonna kill this patient? I know that sounds abrupt, but I definitely still distinctly remember feeling that way. And really for the first 4 to 6 months, and this has actually been studied, anesthesia residents read voraciously. It's probably one of the biggest times that they actually read so voraciously. And then after that, once they realize that it's decently hard to kill a patient and that they've developed these standards of things that actually let them get through that experience, then they're not very receptive to any future feedback. And then they lose opportunities to improve performance beyond that. And I think one of the things I will say about this is that this is key in your residents that are really, really good at managing clinical situations, but they fail their standardized board exams. And I've had several fellows that I've had as program director in the past where I sometimes look at how in the heck did they fail their board exams because they're so stellar clinically. And the truth is that they're stellar because they've learned the pattern recognition of the things to do right. But when it comes to actually knowing how to apply the anesthesia, they don't do so well. So this picture, I love this picture. I found this one day when I was looking out the plane window in the midst of COVID. And it just goes to show you that here's this cargo plane that's developing a therapeutic alliance by wearing a mask. So here's the meat of what I kind of want to point out. And I do apologize, this slide is busy. One of my colleagues has said that you should never apologize for slides, but I don't like to put a lot of words on slides, but this is really the essence of what I would encourage all of you to do. We all should be actually defining our behavior expectations so that success is attainable. Don't set your trainees up to do things that you know that they can't obtain. Feedback should be based on an assessment of observable behaviors, not attitudes. And the idea here is that if you're working with someone that you've heard bad attitudes about, don't necessarily walk in that situation assuming that they're going to perform the same way for you, because that always sets them up for failure. The teacher and trainees should be allies. Remember, as I said a minute ago, we're dealing with adults, and adults don't, first of all, they only like to learn what interests them, and they typically are resistant to change. I think about my mother, who for years drove a Honda, and there was no way in the world I could ever get her to change her mind about a Honda because she was so set in the idea that this was the car for her, and because it didn't necessarily break down, that there was no way that I could actually ever get her to see that there are other good cars out there. It's a horrible analogy, but if you knew my mother, you'd understand. Feedback, you must be credible in the mind of the learner. This is one of the reasons why I really kind of shy away from clinical care guidelines. And I'm sure at this point in time, Dr. Buckland's probably cringing. It's not that I don't think that they're necessarily beneficial, but what I really have a problem with clinical care guidelines is it actually teaches our trainees to not necessarily think about what they're doing. It allows them to have a rubric to perform anesthesia or to do medicine. And so one of the things that I actually do in order for me to maintain credibility, so that if I ask a trainee to actually deviate from the clinical care guidelines, is that we sit and we talk about it. We do this made the clinical care guidelines because it's good evidence or it's good practice. However, if I'm asking you to change and use another opiate that's not on the clinical care guidelines, this is the reason I'm asking you to do it. And I think it establishes credibility. I'm never asking a trainee to do something that I wouldn't do myself. You need to give feedback based on firsthand data. If a trainee asks you how they did as far as putting in central lines and you've never observed that, it's probably not wise for you to give them feedback based on potentially hearsay. This is important. Feedback should be expected, should be given in a timely manner. So it should be in the moment. And if it requires you saying, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback right now, then so be it. At least it establishes that mantra that you're willing to discuss a current action that you just saw and that you're willing to help them change for the better. Feedback should be limited to behaviors that are remedial or actionable. Feedback should be able to describe the consequences of their actions. I had a very wise instructor, mentor of mine, who used to say he was not very well prolific in the anesthesia community, but he used to say there's probably not a lot I can do for your career, but there certainly is a lot that I can do to hurt your career. And the idea was not was he was out squashing everyone's dreams, was that if you were unprofessional, if you consistently did behaviors or did clinical practice that was not safe, certainly it's a small community and he knew that he could potentially, for the sake of patient safety or for the sake of professionalism, that there was obviously consequences to trainees that had bad behavior, bad performance. You want to address specific performances, not generalities, right? I could spend a whole talk on the feedback sandwich, which is now perceived to not be a good idea. But you want to definitely look at specific performances and don't say things like, you need to read more, or you should study for boards. And I have some examples of some bad feedback, in my opinion, here in just a second. And then most importantly, make sure that you regulate your feedback. It doesn't necessarily need to be 3, 4. You don't need to go minute by minute of your experience with that trainee. 1 to 2 issues is fine. Most training programs are a minimum of 3 years. So you have plenty of time, trainees have plenty of time to acquire other areas of feedback. All right. So what do I break this all down to? So one of the things that I say is that, the prepare to adapt model, the R2C2 model, I actually just adapt an ask, tell, ask model, right? You ask the trainee what they did, you elicit self-reflection, then you have a conversation, you have a tell piece where you tell them both reinforcing corrective behavior, you want to use non-judgmental language, and you want to focus on 2 to 4 areas, and you want to look for things that you can change, observable, modifiable things. And then you want to circle back to the trainee and make sure that they understand, and you ask them, what can we do better in the future? How can I help you do better in the future? And how can we set you up for success? And in the last couple of slides, I apologize, I'm kind of racing through this because I know that we're over time. I just have some examples from my previous experiences, my previous life as a PD, of some bad feedback. And this is a very, very busy slide, but these are things that are I picked out over the years of things that I think are generally bad feedback. Things like, and these are direct quotes. So ultrasound guided vascular access. What does that tell the trainee about what they need to improve upon, or how does it give them guidance? This one here's one that's describing a trainee as they're bringing emotions into it, that trainee is too emotional, that trainee is too unmotivated. Yes, these might be things that need to be addressed, but they're things that necessarily need to be addressed in very specific directed manners. My favorite bad feedback I ever received was this one as a program director. She needs to think more through her cases more carefully, which is not bad feedback. However, this particular instructor went specifically to a personality trait, and albeit this particular person did complain a lot about PBJ unavailability in the cafeteria, which stands for peanut butter and jelly. That doesn't necessarily need to make it back into feedback. And then last but not least, I wanted to share some really good positive feedback. And just because that these are lengthy or wordy does not necessarily mean that they're necessarily makes them good. But if you read through some of these, and I know we don't have necessarily enough time, it not only does it kind of address particular concerns, but it also offers encouragement. It also offers areas of improvement. right? So for example, I'll use this one down here. Take more ownership of your anesthetic plans. Instead of saying things like, well, that's how so-and-so does it, or that's how we did in residency, you know, this person goes on to say that, you know, your plan may not match the attendings, but you need to be able to explain your reasoning. You need to learn from theirs to help basically influence your future practice. And I'm happy to share any of these with anyone if they're that curious. And this was the last slide here. One of the things I included about this one, and there's several highlighted components that I think are strength words or buzzwords in order to kind of entice good positive feedback. But the thing about this particular aspect of feedback is at the end, this instructor says, I expect, you know, setting expectations, setting goals for the learner to set up for improvement and things that this particular instructor is going to look for in changes for the future. All right. And that is it for me.
I know that we are over time. Thank you so much, speakers. That was wonderful. Such a wonderful, great reminder. I'll start out with a question. I know many people have to go. They have clinic, etc., but I don't because I'm working in the hospital today. So I wanted to ask, especially Dr. Clopton, I am finding I'm program director, so I interviewed 183 people this season because it was virtual. And I would say maybe 15% of them, I'm going to say, when I asked a question like, what can you contribute to our evolving art of family medicine or something big like that? Growth mindset was something that is on the tongues of our med students and something they're learning, I think, because I'm guessing that not every one of them is getting the book Growth Mindset from their parents or something. Like it's part of their education, which I think is great. But I'm wondering then, I guess I just bring that up and say, have you noticed that? Are you noticing that we have a cadre of learners who are coming in, who have been educated into our GME programs, have been educated along these lines, and any thoughts about how to further that education with them?
I have
Short of you
somewhat. I've
all
also
coming to speak at each of our residencies.
Right.
I think that I've noticed some med students are really open to it, and at the same time, some really don't want feedback. They're very worried about that. I think as far as selecting candidates that have grittiness and growth mindset, Duckworth has spoken to that a little bit. And what she says most predicts a gritty sort of applicant is longitudinal activities. So not doing a bunch of short, different activities, but doing, say, if you're applying to med school, you worked as a CNA at the same long-term care facility for 3 years, as opposed to doing multiple different shadowing or volunteering or things like that. And then I think that it's one of those things, we talk about this in our teaching scholars program, that when we talk about sticky learning is sometimes they don't understand. I think one of the things important is to tell them why it's important. And we talk about that with different learning techniques that we're trying to use that students may or may not like. Make sure they understand why we think this is going to help them. And I think that will help with the introduction of growth mindset if people are naturally fixed mindset.
Thank you.
Did that answer the question somewhat?
Yeah. It's just a bit of a conundrum to me that I have people coming in with varying levels of education in this way. I'm going to guess, and Dr. Zimmer might have something to say about this with curriculum reform, that it is something that is being taught, will increasingly be taught in medical schools, because it's part of of more kind of competency-based education.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that we both would like to foster in students, but also recruit for in the admissions process. So really sort of saying this curriculum is going to require some self-starting, this curriculum is going to require stick-to-itiveness, and that type of grit is something that we're going to hope to be selecting for as people come in. I'm going to acknowledge also Dr. Saint-Fard's comment that some of the middle schools, the DSST middle schools discuss growth mindset here in Denver. And so we're actually seeing this happen across younger age groups, where that discussion of what it means to be, have that growth mindset is something that we're going to see earlier and earlier. And hopefully that will translate to having medical students and future residents who also have the same approach. So I want to be respectful of people's times and would like to thank our speakers once again, and encourage those of you who are here to fill out the survey giving feedback to our wonderful speakers. And I think we got some ideas for things we'd like to have you come back and share with us again. So another virtual round of applause to everyone, and thanks to everybody for attending today. And of course, thanks to Erin for all her hard work in organizing these sessions. Just as a reminder too, we do save recordings of the grand rounds, and they'll be posted on our website, and we'll send those out to everyone as well. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.